The aim of our trip into the Lurs of Kazakhstan was to investigate the interactions between aeolian deposits and what they can tell us about climate circulation. So there were three scientists. There was Andrea Aquino, Catherine Fitzsimmons, Kai Sichter, and for safety we had Stefano Michelazzi, a mountaineer from Italy. We did a lot of driving looking for the right sorts of sites. One good place to look is very often on the edges of villages where they are extracting the Lurs material for building material, which they turn into bricks for their houses. And also along the banks of rivers where you often have incision and erosion of the aeolian deposits, and you get some nice exposures of the aeolian deposits, the Lurs. Then you get down to the fieldwork, and of course one thing which we need to make sure of is that what we're looking at is a primary deposit that hasn't been smeared or smudged by material that's redeposited. So what we have to do, of course, is clean back the face, and we have to do this on ropes because we're looking at cliffs which don't have any access otherwise. That's the reason why we had the mountaineer with us, to make sure that everything was safe. So even though all three of us had climbing experience and experience in the field, we still had a training with Stefano, our mountaineer, on the safety aspects of abseiling down aeolian deposit cliff faces. We double roped everything, that was for extra safety. And we did some tests before we went over the face, of course. And then once we'd gotten used to the ropes a little bit, then we also had to get used to actually working on the ropes. So like I say, even though all three of us had experience of working like this, we still needed to get used to working with the equipment again. Of course, this was also the first campaign since Corona, since 3 years, so we also had to get back into the hang of things. Slowly does it. So the first step, of course, is making sure we have a nice clean profile of stratigraphy to work with. Now, when you're working in August in the middle of Central Asia and it's more than 30 degrees, that can be pretty strenuous because these aeolian deposits have actually been sitting there baking in the sun, and these are very often used for bricks and things as well. They've got material properties which holds the grains together very well, but of course what that means is that our cliff faces are pretty well like concrete. So it involves a lot of digging back and exposing your profile bit by bit by bit. And not to overdo it, of course, we take plenty of breaks. We get off the ropes as well. We change the personnel who are working on the cliff face. And you will see quite a lot of this in our movie because there is just so much digging to do. It took several days to actually clear a section before you were able to work on it. When we've finally managed to clean things back, then we can start doing the science. So firstly, we have to make sure that we've got the depths properly marked. We do that first. And then we start logging the stratigraphy and making notes about the stratigraphy. Then the last thing which happens is the actual sampling. And at this particular site, it's called Mambet, and it's on the edge of the village of Mambet in Kazakhstan. We were collecting samples at 5 centimetre intervals. We were collecting these samples for a number of different sedimentological analysis, grain size, magnetic characteristics, chemistry, and eventually we will be looking at the provenance of this material as well, how this might link to the bedrock and to the nearby rivers and to the nearby glaciers. When we're looking at the stratigraphy, it's really important to look at things at very fine detail. So for that, we have special tools. This one we call the Pierre tool, named after a colleague of ours, Pierre-Antoine, who is based in France and actually designed this tool. And this enables us to take a really close look at the sediments at the millimetre level. You can get all sorts of information about this once you get your eye in. One of the things that we're looking at here is actually information within the sediments that shows that there was seasonal ice within cracks within the sediments there. So it looks like we were looking at a periglacial environment at the time of deposition of this loess and possibly a bit after. Of course, you note all of that down in your field notebook. So we're in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan is a steppe environment, and one of the main pastoral animals which they have in Kazakhstan is horses. So, of course, yeah, it's pretty interesting when you've got a bunch of foreigners dangling off some ropes, and the local shepherds or horse herds come in and want to have a chat and bring their horses with them while we're sampling. Still part of the job. And here we're sampling at 5 centimetre intervals again for various sedimentological analyses. So we take bulk samples, make sure that there's no contamination between the samples, label the bags very carefully, and this is something that we need to do as partner work. And then, of course, well, we're looking at quaternary deposits here. And we want to know, how quickly did this sediment deposit, and how does it relate to climatic changes around in the region, but also further afield across the hemisphere and across the globe. So for that, of course, we need to know when these things were deposited. So we collected samples for luminescence dating, which is a method which works with minerals like quartz and feldspar, which are of course very common in our loess deposits. And they determine the timing since the sediments were last exposed to sunlight. Of course, that means collecting samples in light-proof stainless steel tubes. And we need to hammer those into our section, of course. That's a foothold. Sampling for luminescence dating doesn't just involve collecting a tube. That tube will give you information about when the amount of charge which is built up within our quartz and our feldspar, but then we also need to know what the rate of charge addition to our minerals is. So for this so-called dose rate analysis, we need to collect material from surrounding our tube. And that's what Dr. Aquino is doing here. We try and keep things as much in situ as possible, but as you can see, sometimes these things are a bit crumbly. Now, another thing that we noticed when we were exploring the area was that there are some exposures along the nearby river which show the contact between fluvial and fluvial lacustrine sediments and the loess deposited on top. So we were interested in finding out what the nature of those sediments was like, what the nature of the contact was like, and if possible to get information about how old that fluvial lacustrine material was. So for that, because we suspected that that material was quite old, we collected some oriented samples for paleomagnetic analysis. Of course, to get to our profile, well, we needed to walk across the river, which was quite nice actually when it's more than 30 degrees. There we are, taking a look at the nature of the sediments, and here are our oriented samples for paleomagnetic analysis. The second part of our field expedition involved looking at lake sediments, and this was a different team. We were working with Annette Junginger and Bernd Wagner from Cologne. Annette is from Tübingen, and also Pavani Mishra, who is based in Ehrwag in Switzerland. And this involved collecting lake cores from fairly remote areas, as you can see. For that, we needed to be able to transport our sampling gear, and so we had inflatable kayaks, which, as you can see here, are tied together with core liners. Now, mind you, although Bernd Wagner is looking quite summery here, the water itself was about 6 degrees, so it was a bit fresh. And here we're looking at a mountain environment. So we're at about 1,800 meters above sea level. We needed to check the stability of our watercraft before getting in and even considering taking our lake cores from the lake itself. We also had very little idea how deep the lake was until we were able to get out onto the lake and measure the depth with our fish finder. And then we got going with collecting our cores. For that, of course, we need to make sure that our core goes in a vertical direction and that our watercraft is stable. But here we have a pretty nice core actually. We didn't really know what to expect because nobody's investigated these lakes before. This particular lake that you see here, this is a different one to what you just saw. This is Lake Kolsai, which is, it's nowadays, it's an Instagram site. And we actually collected our cores from a paddle boat. So Pavani and I, Catherine, were busy keeping that boat in place while Bound and Annette were collecting the core. The lake at this point was about 38 meters deep. And of course, for the tourists around, they were quite interested in what we were doing, kept asking us, and we were trying to concentrate on taking our samples. Of course, there's all sorts of other things happening behind the scenes while we're in the field and while we're getting ready for field work. You can get some idea of the accommodation that we stayed in some places. And just how beautiful some of these places can be.